Most people have no idea what just happened with the U.S. military. 6 former top military officials just released a warning, and it's not about politics as usual. It's about something deeper, and it could reshape how America's most trusted institution operates for decades to come. What if I told you that the way troops get deployed, the way young people decide whether to serve, even the way our allies trust us around the world, all of that is shifting right now, because of moves most people aren't even noticing? Today, I'm going to break down what's really in that report, the hidden pattern that's been building for months, and why even people who support these policies should be paying attention to what it means long term. Let's start with what actually happened, because, beneath the headlines, there's a much bigger story most people missed. You know how sometimes you hear a news story and your gut tells you there's more to it than what they're showing? That's exactly what happened on November 17th, when this report dropped. The cameras weren't rolling. There wasn't a press conference. But 6 people who spent their entire careers at the highest levels of military leadership: Navy Admiral Steve Abbott, Coast Guard Admiral Thad Allen, Army Secretary Louis Caldera, Army General George Casey, Air Force Secretary Deborah Lee James, and Navy Secretary Sean O'Keefe, published something called The Perils of Politicizing the U.S. Military. These aren't activists. These aren't political commentators. These are people who commanded troops, managed billion-dollar budgets, and made life and death decisions. And they're saying something fundamental is shifting in how the military is being used. Not just policies they disagree with, but an actual erosion of the boundary that has kept the military outside partisan politics for 250 years. Here's what they're responding to. Since January, we've seen National Guard deployments that look different from anything in recent history. 4,000 troops, plus 700 Marines sent into Los Angeles. Not because of a natural disaster, not because local authorities requested help, but to respond to protests against immigration enforcement. California's governor said no. The deployment happened anyway. Same pattern in Chicago. Same in Portland. Same in Washington, D.C. Every single deployment targeted a city run by Democratic officials. Then the courts started weighing in. Federal Judge Charles Breyer looked at the Los Angeles situation and ruled the administration violated the Posse Comitatus Act, the law that says you cannot use the military for domestic law enforcement. His reasoning was straightforward. There was no rebellion. There were protests, yes, but nothing local police couldn't handle. The justification for sending in troops didn't match the reality on the ground. But here's where it gets more complicated than just deployments. In March, 6 top military leaders were fired in what Democrats called the Friday Night Massacre. Among them, the only female 4-star officer in the entire military. The official reason? They were never given one. But Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had been talking for months about replacing woke officers with ones focused on lethality. Then there were the rallies. Trump spoke at Fort Bragg in June, and instead of talking about military readiness or thanking troops for their service, he spent an hour attacking Biden, mocking Gavin Newsom, criticizing Democrats. Active duty soldiers in uniform sat there listening. Some were reportedly handpicked based on political views. MAGA merchandise was sold on the base. Military.com called it blurring the long-standing and sacrosanct line between the military and partisan politics. The 6 former officials put it this way in their report. When service members, senior leaders, or military symbols are perceived as aligned with political agendas, the public begins to see the institution as partisan rather than national, and once eroded, that trust is difficult to rebuild. Think about that phrase for a second. Once eroded, that trust is difficult to rebuild. They're not saying this might happen. They're saying it's already happening. National Guard troops, deployed to Los Angeles, told family members They felt like pawns in a political battle they never signed up for. Career officers are watching colleagues get fired and learning to self-censor. Young people considering military service are seeing an institution that looks less like it serves the country and more like it serves whoever happens to be in power. This isn't about whether you support Trump's immigration policies or his approach to crime. This is about something structural changing underneath all of that. And in the menorah of there is kamas as from the basing of the padak as from minor to buy the padak. Now step back for a second, because once you understand what shifted behind the scenes, everything looks different. Here's the thing most people don't realize. The U.S. military has been the most trusted institution in America for decades. Not the media, not Congress, not corporations or churches or universities. The military, consistently, across every poll, across both parties, people trusted that when they saw troops deployed, or generals testifying, or service members in uniform, those people were working for the country, not for a political party. That trust wasn't an accident. It was built deliberately through rules that kept the military out of partisan politics. No campaigning in uniform, no political rallies on bases, no generals endorsing candidates. The entire system was designed around one principle. The military serves the Constitution and the American people, not whoever happens to be president. But trust is like a bridge. It takes years to build, and it can collapse in months if the foundation starts cracking. And right now, we're watching those cracks appear in real time. Think about it from a recruit's perspective. You're 18, 19 years old, thinking about joining. Maybe it's family tradition. Maybe it's the benefits. Maybe you genuinely want to serve your country. But now, when you look at the military, what do you see? You see troops deployed to American cities based on what looks like political calculations, every city run by the other party. You see high-ranking officers fired with no explanation except they weren't loyal enough. You see active duty soldiers sitting through political speeches, attacking half the country. If you're a kid from a Democratic family, you start wondering, is this institution really for all Americans, or just for some? If you're from a Republican family, you might feel good about it now. But what happens when the other party takes power and uses the military the same way? The report from those 6 former officials spells it out clearly. This loss of trust makes it harder to recruit across the political spectrum, harder to retain talent, and harder to reassure allies and deter adversaries abroad. Let's break down what that actually means in practice. Recruitment is already struggling. In 2023, the military faced a 41,000 troop shortfall, the worst recruiting year since 1940. That was before any of this current politicization. Imagine trying to convince young people to join now, when the institution looks less like a unifying national force, and more like it's being used as a political tool. Retention is even more revealing. The military depends on experienced, mid-level officers and senior enlisted personnel, people who've been in for 10, 15, 20 years. These are the people who actually run things day to day, who train new recruits, who maintain institutional knowledge, and many of them are watching what's happening and quietly updating their resumes. Not because they disagree with specific policies, but because they signed up to serve their country, not to be extras in political theater. Then there's morale. Imagine you're deployed. You're doing your job professionally, and then you get sent to Los Angeles during protests. Local authorities didn't ask for you. The governor didn't want you there. A federal judge later rules the deployment was illegal. You're just following orders, but you can feel you're being used as a political prop. How does that change how you see your service? How you talk about it with your family? Whether you encourage your own kids to join? And here's something that doesn't get enough attention: the international dimension. America's allies and adversaries watch very closely how we use our military. When they see troops deployed domestically for what looks like partisan purposes, when they see generals fired for giving professional advice the president doesn't like, they start asking serious questions about reliability. If the military can be used as a political tool at home, what does that mean for commitments abroad? Can they trust that decisions are based on strategy and national interest? Or are they based on whoever's winning the political fight in Washington? The report puts it simply: it becomes harder to reassure allies and deter adversaries abroad. That's diplomatic language for something very serious. Our credibility as a security partner is taking damage. And well, one's and intellizations, we just to arends. Here's where the story gets deeper. Because this isn't just about what's happening now. It's about breaking a pattern that's been in place since the founding of the country. When George Washington resigned his commission in 1783, he did something that shocked the world. He had an army. He had popular support. He could have made himself king. Plenty of revolutionary leaders did exactly that. Instead, he walked away. He established a principle: military leadership serves the nation, not personal ambition. That single act set the standard for everything that came after. The founders were obsessed with one question: how do you build a military strong enough to defend the country, but not so powerful that it threatens democracy? Their answer was to deliberately keep the military out of politics. Congress, not the president, has the power to declare war and raise armies. The military follows civilian leadership, but it does not become a tool of partisan politics. That wasn't idealism. It was a survival mechanism for the Republic. For those who remember civics class, you might recall the Posse Comitatus Act from 1878. It says explicitly that you cannot use federal troops for domestic law enforcement. That law came out of Reconstruction, when military occupation of southern states created exactly the kind of mess the founders feared: troops being used to settle political disputes instead of defending the nation. The Supreme Court reinforced this in 1976 with Greer v. Spock. The court was crystal clear: military bases cannot host partisan political activity. The military's nonpartisan character isn't just tradition, it's constitutional doctrine. Justice Powell wrote a warning worth remembering today: the major socially destabilizing influence in many European and South American countries has been a highly politicized military. Think about what he meant by that. When the military becomes political, civilian control collapses. The institution that's supposed to serve everyone becomes an instrument for whoever controls it. And history shows what happens next. It never ends well. We've seen this pattern play out around the world. Canada, in 1970, the October crisis. Prime Minister Trudeau invoked emergency powers and deployed troops domestically. Even though there was a real threat, the deployment restricted freedoms and sparked years of political backlash. And that was with legitimate justification and temporary limits. More recently, South Korea, in December 2024, President Yoon Suk Yeol, frustrated with an opposition-controlled legislature, declared martial law, sent troops to occupy the National Assembly. The move failed because the military itself refused to fully comply, and the public rose up. But the damage to South Korea's democratic credibility was immediate. Or Turkey, after the 2016 coup attempt, President Erdogan used emergency military powers to purge opponents, jail journalists, rewrite the constitution, and consolidate personal control. The military went from being a check on power to being an instrument of it. Turkey's democracy hasn't recovered. The pattern is consistent. A leader invokes a crisis, real or manufactured. They deploy military forces domestically. They justify it with appeals to order, security, national interest. And in the process, they erode the boundaries that keep military power separate from political power. What made America different is that we built those boundaries carefully and maintained them consistently. Yes, there were clashes. Truman firing MacArthur, Eisenhower disagreeing with Ridgway, but those were about strategy, not about using troops as political props. The military gave professional advice. Civilian leaders made decisions. And crucially, the military was never deployed domestically to advance one party's agenda against another. Until now, when you deploy National Guard troops to every major Democratic-run city, when you fire generals for offering advice you don't like, when you hold political rallies on military bases, when you talk about using the military against the enemy within, and that enemy turns out to be American citizens exercising constitutional rights, you're not just breaking norms. You're dismantling a structure that took 250 years to build. The 6 former officials who wrote that report understand this history. They lived it. They served under presidents from both parties. They know what happens when the military becomes a political instrument instead of a national institution. And they're warning us. We're on a path other democracies have gone down, and it does not end well. And ours dotted exemplis in the 5 Rauente, and the writing is the visualing in the 5 Rauente. So let's talk about where this is actually heading, because the story doesn't stop with that report. Right now, as we're having this conversation, Trump is weighing military options for Venezuela. Officials briefed him last week on everything from airstrikes to direct operations to oust Maduro. The Pentagon has moved more than a dozen warships and 15,000 troops into the region. They're calling it Operation Southern Spear. Whether that happens or not, the fact that it's being seriously considered tells you something about how comfortable the administration has become with military force as a political tool. Domestically, there are plans to use National Guard troops for mass deportations, not just protecting federal facilities, but actually conducting immigration enforcement. That would require invoking the Insurrection Act, which legally allows the military to act as police on U.S. soil. Stephen Miller talked about this strategy publicly back in 2023, before Trump even took office. He said, if Democratic governors won't cooperate, they'll just send National Guard troops from Republican states into Democratic states to do the job anyway. Think about what that means. Troops from Texas conducting law enforcement in California over the governor's objections. Troops from Florida deployed to Illinois. The precedent that sets, once you establish that a president can override state authority and deploy military force domestically for policy enforcement, doesn't go away when administrations change. And here's what keeps me up at night. Honestly, the 2026 midterms are coming. If these deployment patterns continue, if troops become a normal presence in major cities, what happens when election season heats up? There are already concerns about military forces being positioned in ways that could influence voter turnout through intimidation. Whether intentional or not, a polling place with National Guard troops nearby sends a message, even if those troops are there for completely unrelated reasons. The structural shift that's already happened is this. Officers have learned that professional military advice can get you fired if it contradicts political objectives. That creates a selection pressure. The people who rise to the top won't be the ones giving the best strategic counsel. They'll be the ones who tell leadership what it wants to hear. And once that dynamic is established, it's incredibly hard to reverse. But here's what I want you to understand. This isn't about Trump personally. It's about precedent. Whatever powers he claims, whatever boundaries he pushes, whoever comes after him from either party, will inherit those expanded authorities. If deploying troops domestically against political opposition becomes normalized, if firing generals for disloyalty becomes standard, if using military bases for campaign events becomes acceptable, those tools don't disappear when the other party takes power. They just get pointed in a different direction. The trust being eroded right now, the institutional credibility being spent. You can't just rebuild that by changing administrations. Once people see the military as a partisan instrument, once that perception takes root, it changes how the entire system functions. So what do you do with this information? I think the first step is simply paying attention, not getting outraged, and then moving on to the next news cycle. Actually watching how these patterns develop, asking questions about justifications for deployments, noticing when military force gets used, and whether the stated reasons match the reality on the ground, and have conversations, not arguments, conversations, with people who see this differently than you do. Because the only way we maintain any shared reality is by talking to each other, instead of retreating into echo chambers, where everyone confirms what they already believe. If this gave you a clearer way to see what's unfolding, share your thoughts below, not to agree, but to observe. What patterns are you noticing? What concerns do you have? What am I missing in this analysis? Because honestly, we're all trying to make sense of this moment together, and your perspective matters just as much as anyone else's. Factor down, in the pros deferent lace, in the pros deference, here last of